Hello and welcome to the FPL tips video ahead of Game Week 17. We're back after the World Cup break. It's a few days until Christmas and we've got a Game Week deadline coming up on Boxing Day at 11 a.m. in the UK. So adjust for your time zone accordingly. But FPL is back this week, so we need to get straight back into it. What we're going to try and do on this video is we've basically got 4 different tips. There's a lot to cover. So I'm going to try and cover stuff that I've not seen covered in, a lot of other Scout videos. It was a lot of fun doing the Scoutcast last night with Seb and with Andy. So it's well worth checking that out for a more, a more detailed view on everything. But what I'm going to do is just look at four different things. Then we'll go from there. So the first thing that I want to do, and please remember, if you like this video, like and subscribe. And like I said, there's lots of other videos on the channel that will cover, everything where possible, because there is a lot to cover. So we'll get straight into basically where we left off. So in my last tips video for Game Week 16, we looked at exactly what unlimited transfers are. I know it might sound really, really obvious. It's slightly different to a wild card, but at the same time, it's not. We've basically got unlimited free transfers until that deadline. So Boxing Day, 11 a.m. in the UK. Until that point, so from now until that point, we can do as many transfers as we want. The only detriment that could potentially be there is when you get to the end of the season, if you're level on points with a rival, one of the tiebreakers is the number of transfers you've used. So Seb made a great point on the Scoutcast, just make sure you're at least 1 point better off than your rival, and this won't even come into effect. So I'd say tinker freely, put together lots of drafts and sit and see where you end up. But a key thing to note from this is basically all prices are still frozen until that game week deadline on Boxing Day. And then FPL is basically back as normal. So what we're finding there is after that, we've got all our chips as normal. We've got one more wild card. So we're all still given another wild card. Which I think a lot of people are going to be saving that for the double game weeks. But effectively, you could decide in game week 18, 19, 20 to use that wild card. But I would recommend keeping it further, if possible. And all the price changes are going to go back to normal after this Boxing Day deadline. So the game week 17 deadline. So like I say, just a quick refresher on that, just to remind, where we are and explain exactly what those unlimited transfers are. The exciting news is, since we last had a video, there's been some double game weeks announced. A couple of them have got caveats. Well, one of them's got a caveat within, but let's look at those. So on the screen, for those watching on YouTube, I've got basically a fixture ticker that the brilliant Lego Mane's put together. You can follow him on Twitter, LegoMane_FPL. If you're listening to the podcast version, I'll talk you through all the scenarios, but you could also just quickly pop onto YouTube, take a screenshot, and you've then got that. But yeah, so the first double game week, so like I say, we're coming back game week 17 on Boxing Day. After just a couple of weeks or a few days in FPL terms, we've got game week 19 and there's been a double game week added to that. So we've got Fulham against Chelsea. So what that means is Chelsea will have Man City at home and then they'll have Fulham away. Now it's worth bearing in mind with Chelsea, they've also got a cup game in the middle. So the FA Cup third round is actually played after game week 17. So they've got a split double game week, as it were. So they've got Man City at home in the league, Man City away in the FA Cup, followed by Fulham away. So I think Chelsea players are going to be very, very popular. They've got a couple of good fixtures before that. We've got Bournemouth at home. We've got Nottingham Forest away as well. I think players to look out for here are keep your eyes on Scout for any news on Kepa. If he's number one, he's only 4.5 million. So I think he's going to be a very, very popular keeper, if he's fit and if you think he's going to keep Mendy out of the team, like he was doing before the World Cup. There's Reece James. He's always popular. He wasn't in the England squad. I think he was touch and go. Like Southgate talked about it. Reece James was very upset, but he didn't make the cut for the squad. Southgate didn't feel he'd be ready for the World Cup. So again, keep your eyes out for him because I think he's a fantastic option and may well be one of the best captain options for this game week as well. So we've got Kepa and we've got James. Now, I don't know who else to go for because I feel like players like Cucurella, he wasn't in the Spain squad, but is he nailed? Probably not. Do you want 3 Chelsea defenders when there's so many good defenders, we're going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at Man City defenders, potentially Arsenal defenders, Newcastle defenders. Some people might be looking at Trent and Robertson, for a bit of Liverpool coverage. I know they're not quite as popular as they were a few months ago, but there's a lot of good defenders. So I don't think Cucurella will be an option. Potentially Mount, and potentially, I dare not say, I'm going to say it, but Sterling could be an option, and we will get to that later in the video, just as a warning. But I think Chelsea players are going to be very, very interesting. Then we got Fulham. So Fulham will have Leicester away and then Chelsea at home. I think that's two brilliant fixtures. A lot of us already had, players like Mitrovic. Pereira is a very, very popular enabler in the teams, and you could even look at Leno in goal. It's double game week season. They've got Crystal Palace away, Southampton at home, and then this double game week of Leicester away and Chelsea at home. There is a bit of a warning with Mitrovic, which we'll get to in one of the future tips. But I think Pereira's a fantastic option. So that's game week 19. Then we move on to game week 20. So just the week after, we might have, another double game week. Now, this is the one with a caveat. So Man City against Tottenham will be in game week 20 if neither team need an FA Cup third round replay. So basically, if we have a look at, we go to Lego Mane's table, then the Man City need to basically not have a replay, and then we will be good for that double game week. So City would have Man United away and then Tottenham at home. Then Tottenham would have Arsenal at home and Man City away. So these are big teams, maybe not the best fixtures, but big teams, and we need to be really aware of that. So I think Man City players, they're obviously going to be very popular on the wild card. Spurs players, a bit more tricky, and again, a bit like Mitrovic, we will discuss that in one of the future tips as well. So it's just worth being aware of that. And just to reiterate on the caveat that we had there, both teams need to avoid a replay. So we need a result in the third round for Man City and for Tottenham as well. If either of them draw, it will go to a third round replay, and this double game week won't happen. And then the third and final one that's been announced for now is Arsenal against Man City. So we've got Man City once again. This game week's a little further in the future. This is the start of February. So the 11th of February, game week 23 starts. So we'd have Man City would have a nice double game week here. So they'd have Villa at home and then Arsenal away. Arsenal would have Brentford at home, which is a great fixture. And then they play Man City. But again, that's at home. So I quite like those fixtures. I think I'd imagine most people will have 3 Arsenal and 3 City for this, even though they're playing against each other. So there's no caveat on that one. So game week 23, Arsenal and Man City would have a double game week. So the tip for this is basically, so just to reiterate, we've got Chelsea and Fulham have a double game week. Man City v Spurs, if there's no FA Cup replay. So keep your eyes on the FA Cup. And then Arsenal against Man City. And there will be more to follow. So with all these cup games coming up, etc., a lot of rearranged fixtures to be moved. I think this is going to move quite quickly, quite fluidly. So it's well worth, checking out Fantasy Football Scout articles. It's also worth having a look at, what Lego Mane puts out as well. Now, we've covered suspension tightrope quite a lot in previous weeks, and I think it wasn't relevant before the World Cup, but it is relevant now. Now, we've still got Saliba and Jesus on this list, so they've got 4 yellow cards. They need to get to 19 games played, so a team has to play 19 games before this is wiped. If a player gets a 5th yellow card, they will get suspended for 1 game. So Saliba, he's still on 4 yellow cards, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Obviously, we're on limited free transfers, so I do strongly feel that Gabriel, his stats are so much better than Saliba. I think Gabriel is worth it over Saliba, and Ben White as well, much better value. I think the only time I would go against this is, you might have picked up Saliba for 4.5 million. He's obviously risen a lot, so maybe then you want to consider holding on for him. But it's just being worth aware that Saliba, he's probably not the best Arsenal defender anyway, and he's 1 yellow card away from a suspension. Then we've got Gabriel Jesus. Obviously, he's come back from the World Cup and is injured. He's out for like 3 months or something, so we can ignore that. Bailey and McGinn at Aston Villa, both on 4 yellows. The interesting one here is Bailey. He's dropped to 4.5 million, and we discussed him on the Scout last week, or the Scoutcast last night. He's a brilliant enabler. It's just worth bearing in mind that he's on 4 yellow cards. So yeah, that's put a bit of a dampener on that one, because I was looking at some formations where I had basically 2 budget midfielders. I'd have Pereira, I'd have Bailey. Yeah, that one I think I need a bit more thought on, so definitely worth paying attention to. I don't want to spend too much more time on this. So the key 2 I can see here are Mitrovic and Kane. Now, Mitrovic, we discussed, he's got 2 good fixtures and then he's got a double game week. This could cause complications though, because he could get suspended ahead of the double game week, turning it into a single game week, or he could get suspended during the double game week, after the deadline's gone, and then miss the second game, and it ends up being a single game week. So, I mean, the best case scenario is he gets booked, this game week, misses game week 18, and then he's good to go for the double. It's just worth paying attention to. I think he's good enough to keep. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be sticking with Mitrovic, but again, it's worth being aware of, especially as we're on unlimited transfers. Gives a bit more importance to having a semi-decent bench. Also, Kane obviously has had a great season. There's been a lot of penalties, as we've discussed on the Scoutcast last night, but for the price and the fact he could get suspended, I think for me, I would probably avoid Kane, and it pains me to say it because he's been absolutely brilliant. Obviously, I feel for him after what happened to him during the World Cup, but again, it's worth paying attention. If you're going to have Mitrovic and Kane, I think you're playing with fire a little bit there, where you've got two strikers that could end up being suspended. Just another one I want to touch on really, really briefly is Fabian Schär. Obviously, I think due to price, he's about 4.8 million from memory. You've got Botman at 4.4. Schär went to the World Cup. Botman didn't. I don't think there's any reason, looking at stats, etc., to go for Schär. If you're going for that second Newcastle defender after Trippier, I'll just go, quite clearly, I'd go for Sven Botman. So just to reiterate, the players to be aware of, I feel like from that big list, Saliba, Kane, Mitrovic, Schär and Bailey, all on 4 yellow cards. If they get booked, they're going to get a game suspension. What I wanted to do here was something slightly different. So I did think about going through, all the attacking players, going through all the defensive players, but it's quite similar to what we were looking at, before the World Cup started. So now we've got the double game week, so I decided to use the Scout Rate My Team tool and actually look ahead at Captaincy. So Captaincy, obviously, for this game week. And then I want to look at Captaincy for game week 19, and I want to look at Captaincy for game week 20 as well. Now, I know I mentioned that double game week that's coming up in 23, but Rate My Team doesn't go that far ahead. So the reason I think this is important is, again, to mention the Scoutcast, we had a really good discussion on it last night regarding, what kind of players we're going to be looking at to captain in all the different weeks, because obviously we've come off a period where some people have been very successfully just captaining Haaland every single week. But I think having double game weeks means while we're on unlimited transfers, we want to have a route to the best captain each week. We could divert from that. We don't have to go for who we plan to captain now, but I think it's definitely worth a discussion. So we'll start with 17, because this is a tips video for 17. And Haaland is clear, on top. Haaland 6.72 projected points, just ahead of Bruno Fernandes at 5.92. So Bruno Fernandes actually sits in second. So what's interesting about that is obviously Ronaldo has obviously left. So Bruno will be definitely on penalties. So Bruno, I think he is one worth considering. Now, I'd still captain Haaland, for game week 17. I feel like that's not even a debate. But it's worth just looking at these players who are ranked quite highly. Now, just to go below Bruno, we then got De Bruyne, 5.69. Salah, 5.62. Reece James, 5.15. Sterling at 5.12. And then we've got Rashford, Saka, Martinelli, Zaha, Kane, Odegaard, all slight, just behind them. What I think is interesting about this is we can see, players good for 17. There's a few Chelsea players in here. We discussed Reece James. I think he could be one of the best captains, not just in this week, but for the double. But what's surprising here is obviously Sterling is quite high at 5.12. So that's interesting and just worth putting a pin in that. So we'd leave 17 because I think, Haaland is the clear captain. But it does show we could consider players like Bruno, and the Chelsea players are good ahead of the double as well. Now, I want to go into game week 19 captaincy. Now, obviously, this is the double game week we discussed where Fulham and Chelsea play twice. And if we look at this, Sterling's actually top at 7.53, which is pretty interesting. He's not been, a great success at Chelsea so far. Obviously, he's probably benefited historically playing in that Pep Guardiola team at Man City where he put up incredible numbers. And I guess one of the risks with Chelsea is we saw Potter rotate, and it wasn't just like a slight rotation. He changed the entire team pretty much. So there is some fear over Chelsea. But behind Sterling, we've got Mitrovic. Now, we've discussed the problem with Mitrovic. Unless Mitrovic gets booked this game week, so game week 17, and gets his suspension in 18, there's a huge risk that Mitrovic could end up with a single game week. unless he can just, Diego Costa it and avoid the yellow until the new year. Then we've got Leno just behind, and then Mount, then Reece James, then Andreas Pereira, who would actually benefit if Mitrovic missed a game because we know he's second choice on penalties. But again, during a double game week, if that happens, Andreas is only going to get the one game on penalties, at most. And then we've got Aubameyang just behind. So what I find interesting about this is obviously Sterling, Mount and James being so high. Now, there is that risk. They don't play both games, but they're quite clearly ahead of Haaland. So just for the record, Haaland's at 5.09, just behind Thiago Silva, Salah and Bruno as well. So I do think with our teams, we want to be looking at getting some Chelsea players in. Obviously, I don't think Kepa's on this. Now, I think the reason Kepa might not be on is maybe his minutes haven't been updated. We're not sure if he's definitely first choice. So, Kepa could just be an option for captaincy this week. Maybe a lot of people will just end up going for Haaland, but personally, I'm going to be looking at getting some Chelsea players in. And one of the reasons I'm thinking of this is, we could go for like a Bruno Fernandes. If I go back to the last screen, we could go for a Bruno Fernandes who's heavily rated in game week 17. They've got some really, really good fixtures. We know he's on penalties. Then we could see what happens with Chelsea and maybe switch to a Sterling or switch to a Mount and then put the armband on them. If Reece James is playing regularly, maybe we just captain James. But basically, I want to have some Chelsea players in my team. I want to have options. I want to be able to make that decision when it gets to game week 19. So I may well have 2, potentially even 3 Chelsea players. And then if we skip ahead another week, so we go to game week 20, this is kind of obvious. This is the week when, when Man City are going to have a double. And so will Spurs, as long as they avoid that FA Cup third round replay. You can see quite clearly here, Haaland, De Bruyne, Foden, Kane, Cancelo, Edison, Son. Basically, it's all Tottenham and Man City until you get down to Tony at 5.29. And we don't know if Tony's going to be suspended for this, betting allegations that have been made against him. So quite clearly, if they avoid this FA Cup replay, we're going to want to captain probably Haaland in game week 20. So then it becomes, business as usual, as it were. So I guess the tip for this is, Haaland is, absolutely essential. We're probably going to captain him in 17 and 20 as well if that double game week happens. And probably if the double game week doesn't happen, we're probably still captain him anyway. Now, with Mitrovic having that potential suspension, I definitely want Chelsea assets, as I mentioned, or at least a route to Chelsea assets. So like I mentioned, you could go for like a Bruno Fernandes, maybe even like a Rashford, and then look to move them on to like a Mount or a Sterling. Or you could just have Reece James, and I think he'd be a good captain anyway, to be honest. So I'd like to thank you for joining me for the Game Week 17 tips video. Like I said before, please remember to like and subscribe to Fantasy Football Scout. It's a lot to fit in. So I would highly recommend, there's a lot of good videos on the channel this week, breaking down different wildcard drafts, etc. But what I wanted to do was look at a few different things and go from there really. So thanks a lot for joining me. I'll be back next week. I hope you all have a happy Christmas or a happy holiday at least, and I'll see you next week.